this thing, hero's journey. Has anybody heard about that? This is the original story structure. We're talking about Plato, Socrates. We're talking about any. This is the oldest story, the form of storytelling that we as humans have done. The hero's journey. It's always been about this. So this idea here is nothing new. This has been around since Greeks. It's ancient. It's thousands of years old, and it's just evolved and it works. And so I'm not saying this is the best story structure to use. I'm saying it's the one that Hollywood uses the most. We're going to kind of apply it here because it's the easiest one to wrap your head around. You can take this 3-act structure and expand it out and make it even more complicated. And there's plenty of filmmakers who do it. There's plenty of storytellers who do that. There's plenty of storytellers who don't use this. And there's lots of good movies that avoid this. But in general, if you start looking at most every movie you see, they're going to have this structure built into them. You can pretty much identify 90% of the movies with this structure. And it works because it works for us as an audience. That's why. So that's the good thing. Like, people really connect with this because it's not like, I don't think it's something that the Greeks invented more than they discovered, because it's how what our brain likes, how we like to go on this journey, how we like change and all this stuff. So if you're going to break it down into a nutshell, this is what it is. It's a blueprint for what's going to happen in your movie. It's going to have a 3-act structure. It's going to be a beginning, a middle, and an ending. So it's going to be broken up into Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. So in the beginning, there's going to be Act 1. It's a setup. This is the whole setup where we're introducing the characters. This is where we're going to introduce the environments, the whole world. We're the world that we're creating. And now there's plenty of arguments and plenty of different disciplines when it comes to how long each one of these acts needs to be. Say the Cat has one way, they literally have it down to what page on the script you should be at, what page the climax starts and midpoint and so forth. Other people believe it's much more flexible. This is all up to interpretation as far as how long each act needs to be. And so I'm not here to tell you exactly what that is. That is more of a, you can explore it definitely with some of these other books, and you can talk to other, go look up on YouTube the famous writers or filmmakers, and they're talking about the 3-act structure. You'll get many interpretations of that. So for us, we're just going to concentrate on the structure itself. So Act 1 is set up. There's going to be a beginning somewhere, however the movie starts, right? At some point in the middle of Act 1 is an inciting incident. Something's going to happen. If we introduce to our character with their normal day-to-day life, there's going to be an inciting incident that sets them off in a direction. Could be, Lord of the Rings, the ring, right? Gandalf comes, maybe, and then there's an inciting incident there. So this is going to start our character on a path. So if this is their normal path going this way, they're following that path, and then an inciting incident's going to happen that's going to send them off in a different direction. So they're going to start on this journey, and then they're going to have second thoughts. Am I on the right path? Am I doing the right thing? And that's going to lead up to the climax of Act 1, where something's going to happen that's really going to send them off in a direction. And then once we get into the climax, it's going to be obstacle, midpoint, the big twist, obstacle, disaster, crisis. So in middle of at the end of Act 2, something's going to happen where all hope is lost, everything falls apart, the world's coming to an end, our character is about to face failure. And then from there, it's just going to build up to this. Everything's going to get worse and worse, the end of the world, and then finally resolution to wrap up in either a happy ending or bad ending, depending on how you want to do it. So most movies, we can break them down. They're divided up into these 3 acts. So why does everybody use it? Because it works. That's the one thing. It's a time tested. It's been around for thousands of years. It's fairly easy to master. So that doesn't mean those are the reasons why you should always use it. And I think it's a great place to start as beginning filmmakers, because it helps you structure your story a little bit and gives you direction. But as you grow and become more better at your skills in your career, sure, go off from, break away from this. There's plenty of, filmmakers who don't just follow this perfectly, but a lot of movies do. A lot of Marvel movies. Go watch Marvel movies, right? Isn't there always a point where our main heroes or superheroes going to be at the lowest state of their lives? They lose their powers, something happens, right? And then all is almost lost, and then boom, they have the resolve and they win. Or, well, usually Marvel, they win. So the inciting incident kicks off the story to gear. Everything up to this incident is just setup. Like, hey, here's my house, here's my life, here's what I do, yada, yada, yada. And then this thing happens and boom, it sets the story into gear and it starts moving. So they're going to be heading towards these main turning points at end of Act 1 and Act 2. And these are, again, going to further propel the story either into a slightly surprising direction or towards the climax in Act 3. So the whole goal of this structure, this whole hero's journey, is that we're setting things in motion, and then we're just building up and things in there. We're building up drama. We're conflicts. Everything's happening to make it more interesting. We want drama. This is about drama, right? People are paying for this, so they want to be entertained. If there were no issues, no problems in the movie, right, it would be boring. So again, this is not the perfect model, it's just the one that's mostly used, but it's a great place to start because it's very easy to look at it and figure it out. And don't ask me about the other ones because I'm not that great of a writer to be able to talk about compound story structures and stuff that, excuse me, really, really great writers are able to pull off properly. So the setup. So again, Act 1 is where the main characters are introduced. We see the world they live in, as well as their relationship with other characters. The problem is then introduced, which the protagonist, who is our main character, our hero, has to deal with. This problem and how the main character deals with it will drive the story forward. So let's just break it down to something super simple. New boy in town meets girl. All right, that's the setup. But here's the first problem, right? The inciting incident. Father doesn't like him. So boy wants girl, girl's father doesn't like him. There's our problem. So basic questions. So as you're starting to write your script, these are some of the questions you want to think about. What's the situation? What's the story? What's the plot? What's the theme? What's the story really about? So if is this about dad not liking a boy, or is this about maybe it's an interracial relationship and maybe dad is a racist, and maybe that's the underlying theme here, right? See how you can start weaving something a little bit deeper under the subcontext. So what's the story really about? Okay, who's the protagonist, right? Well, it's got to be the new boy, right? Who's the main antagonist? Well, here it's going to be the dad, right? Because he's opposing, he doesn't like him. Not for his daughter. What's the inciting incident? Maybe there's some moment when they're out somewhere and something happens, and then boom, suddenly dad catches him and starts something. Maybe he punches him. I don't know what it is, but there's something that happens that sets this chain reaction going. So that's going to be that life-changing event. So let's talk about some of the functions of this thing. So having a solid act 1 lets the person reading your script know that they're in good hands. It can't overstate the value of this. It will keep them reading and not putting your script off. So here we're talking about if I do a pitch session, I deliver the log line, I have the treatment written up for the executive producer, like, cool, you know what, I like this. Let me read the script. They're going to start reading the script. If Act 1 sucks and they do this, you're toast. They're never going to finish reading your script. How many people have read people's scripts here? Anybody read a script from a friend or anybody? I've read scripts that I was like, wow, this is awesome. But unfortunately, a good amount of them that I've read have been like, oh God, when's it going to end? If you can't make it through the first act, how do you, if your first act is just putting people to sleep, then how do you expect them to finish through your script? How do you expect someone even to give you money to make your story if you can't get this first act's not tight, because that's your shot. That's, if you really think about it, and this kind of ties back to the save the cat philosophy. They're really heavy on making this act one as good as possible. You want to keep your audience engaged. If I can't get them engaged within act one, then it's over. No one's going to do it. No one's going to read it. No one's going to watch it. No one's going to fund it. So I have to make sure that they don't put it down. And so that's not an answer. That, how do you do that? That's not quite an answer we can answer in one class lecture today. This comes down to reading books. You know, you got to jump on these theories. There's huge amount of options out on the internet now. Even if you read the, you know, Save the Cat book and you're like, wow, I really believe this philosophy. Well, guess what? They have tons of classes that they offer that you can take to learn how to be a better screenplay writer, filmmaker. So that's one avenue. There's plenty of books. There's I think ELAC has screenwriting classes you can take that just focus in on this. So for us, our job is just to understand the basics of it, just the general approach. But if you do want to improve yourself, well, you need to make the next move and take some form of education on it, whether it's classes at a school, online classes, or even just buying some books, or even worst case scenario, go on YouTube and look for some people that may seem like they know what they're doing and try that. But this is like a journey. There's a ton of, it's just like everything we've talked about at this point. You've got to do it to get better at it, to improve. It's all part of the same process of improving yourself as a filmmaker. So first act has to be good. There's a lot of things to look on early. Like we need to get good character introductions, strong scene descriptions. I really want to cement our audience so that they feel like this is a real world. If I just say, Bob walked into his room, he was eager to sit down in front of his computer, that's not very interesting or descriptive. But if we describe his room, what it's about, maybe he's a little neurotic and maybe he's got some weird stuff in his room that kind of helps set up his personality. That shows our audience or the reader that, okay, well, this person's really into weaving the story, that knows storytelling, and I have faith that they're going to be able to deliver this film. So things like that. So what this first act is really supposed to do is set up the world, get the story moving. So you need to really describe the world that you're in, what it is, whether it's some sci-fi futuristic place, some place, you know, in the contemporary world, or maybe it's some, you know, World War II environment that you're in. Whatever it is, you want your audience needs to feel like it's in that and involved and gets encapsulated by it. That's what the first scene is, the first act's about. It has to be tight. It has to grip the reader from the opening pages and keep the story moving. Remember, I think if they averaged out how long people read scripts before they put them down, it's like the first 10 pages. If you can't keep them past the first 10 pages, it's over. No one's going to go through. They're going to put it down and they're going to pass. So you want to be tight and precise. A meandering act one will make the reader's mind wander, and then you're dead in the water. It's over. Game over. So again, this is all, the script is, you know, the blueprint for the movie, but it's also the tool that you're going to use to sell. If you're trying to raise money, even if you just found some investors who are looking to write off a loss somewhere, they're still going to want the movie completed. They're still going to want something out of it. So you still have to get a script that's enticing. And it's hard. And that may mean that you may have an idea for a story, but you may not be capable of writing it. You may have to pay someone to write it. Could be. Like me, I'm not a great screenwriter. If any good ideas I have, I may do a really rough version of it, but chances are I'm going to hire someone and pay them to write it for me, because especially if I think it's that good of an idea, I can't take the chance that I'm going to mess it up, because that's not what I do for a living. And so I'm honest with myself and acknowledge that. And so you guys need to think about that on your own too. And of course, in the beginning, when you're starting out, you're just trying to do it. You're just trying to get as good as you can. So it's all about that. So again, even in the industry, might not be the right one to do it. Spielberg, when we're talking about Spielberg, he doesn't write anything because he doesn't write. He's not a writer. He knows it. He's not. He definitely can take a script and take it to the next direction. He definitely knows what is needed in the script. So I'm not saying he's naive about them, but he's smart enough to know that there's no way in hell he's going to write a script. he's going to hire someone, the real people who really know how to do it. And when you get to that level, then sure, you have that luxury. But the rest of us starting out, you may have to write it because you can't afford to hire someone, or maybe you have a friend who's a writer. That might be cool, but chances are maybe not. So you're going to have to do it. And so then using these ideas to help you guide you is your best chance of making something that's successful. So we get through this whole idea of Act 1. Now we're going to Act 2, confrontation. So Act 2 is where the protagonist goes through major changes in his or her life as he tries to resolve the problem created in Act 1, which is the inciting incident. And only to find that they're getting an even worse situation. So Act 2 is where you think you're going to resolve it, but no, it's just going to get worse. So we'll go back to our boy loves girl, meets girl. So basically in Act 2, boy loses girl and fights against all impossible odds to get her back. So maybe dad convinces her that this is the wrong guy for her, or something happens, or maybe dad sets up the boy up to look like he's doing something, like he's a criminal or something, and she's like, I can't be with this person, and leaves. He's lost the chance. She won't talk to him. She won't get back to him. She won't even acknowledge him. He feels like he's just lost it. It's no chance at all. So this would be Act 2. So basic questions to ask, basic questions to answer in Act 2. What's the main problem the protagonist has to solve? Is it physical? Is it psychological? So these problems don't have to be always physical. They could be something going on in their head. It could be emotional. What are the obstacles that stand in the way of the protagonist? What characters, could be events, inner weaknesses, stop the protagonist from achieving their goal? It could be weather, right? It could be the environment. There's plenty of things that could do it. How does the protagonist overcome each obstacle, each action? So there should be in Act 2 a bunch of little things that happen that you this is the roller coaster ride that we bring our audience on. And again, I'm not picking on Marvel movies, but they're really notorious for this, man. There's all these ups and downs that happen in Act 2. It's like so much stuff happening. Boom, oh, lost, win, lost, oh, love affair broke up, this happened. It's like, and they're almost to the point where they're almost the same from every movie, because they follow this model very, very much. So is there a B story? Is there a side love affair happening in the character? Is there something else happening? So if we go back to Titanic, what's the B story in Titanic?
Would it be the older Rose story?
Yeah, it's them on the ship, listening to the story, her deal, the expedition leader trying to find, the diamond. That's the B story. That's one of the B stories. So I would weave something in there. And again, if you look at Titanic, they did a really good job of doing this, of creating these multiple layers happening at once. So what's the all is lost moment? Okay, so at some point in Act 2, towards the end, it's where everything falls apart. The worst things can happen. I'm a superhero. I lost my powers. I'm Superman, and I got kryptonite on me, and I'm just helpless and about to die. What's the point where the protagonist almost dies, either physically or emotionally? So everything's about to fall apart. There's no way anything's going to win. At the end of Lord of the Rings, right? They're on the Mount Doom or whatever it is, and what happens to Frodo? He gets the ring and basically submits to it, and then we see him starting to turn evil. That's where all the moments lost. The whole movie, the whole 3 movies, comes to this point where we're like, oh my God, our character who was so strong went through all of these obstacles throughout these 3 movies. Now finally gets there to finish his mission, throw the ring into the fires of Mount Doom, and what happens? He changes his mind and realizes that he can't leave the ring, and suddenly the evilness comes out, and all is lost. But then, of course, it gets resolved. So you want to think about answering some of these questions. So also, Act 2 can be thought of as the confrontation portion of the 3-act structure. Act 2 is where the meat of your story happens. This is where everything's going to happen. Remember, the Act 1 is the setup. That's where it's setting up the world, setting up the characters. That inciting incident's going to trigger the path of our characters off to somewhere. That's all set up there. Act 2 is the big chunk of the movie. This is where everything's going to happen as the journey happens. The they're trying to get the Mount Doom to destroy the ring. They're trying to be lovers on the Titanic. All that stuff's going to happen, and then what happens at the end of Act 2? Well, boom, we hit an iceberg. Happens. So the confrontation part of the 3-act structure. This is where all the problems are going to happen. Act 2 is the meat. We thrust into the forward motion of the story. Our characters have to start trying and failing to achieve what they want. There should be no simple path to success. If there is, well, guess what? It's going to be boring. Your audience is going to be like, okay, well, saw that coming. Act 2 ends the moment your character suffers the worst loss imaginable. So once we get through that, and that usually takes us to the end, the last act. Last act is the wrap of the movie. So, and then we hit Act 3, which is resolution. Act 3 is when the main character tries one last time to solve the problem presented in Act 1, and where the main character comes to the understanding of the meaning of the underlying theme, that message you were trying to create in your movie. What's that underlying theme? This is when the aha moment happens, when your main character suddenly realizes what's going on, what's it about. It's also where all the other story elements, any subplots, any character relationships, everything that you create in Act 1 and Act 2, any of these subplots or loose ends, all need to come and tie up here at the end. Anybody watch a movie where things just didn't get resolved at the ending? There's certain parts where you're like, man, what happened? They never explained what happened. It's frustrating, right? So anything, any subplots, anything you set up in these first 2 acts, it should come to a conclusion. It should wrap up. It should make sense for your audience. A really well-written script and well-made movie will do that. It won't leave anything untied, any loose ends, unless, and again, unless they're planning to go in a sequel. So if it's already written to be a sequel movie written, then maybe you could leave some things untied, but not to the point where it's confusing or upsetting. So I go back to our boy meets girl. At the end, well, boy gets girl and they live happily ever after. Maybe dad finally realized his mistakes. Maybe dad died. I don't know. Whatever happens with dad, that stops, and she sees the truth in what's going on with this boy and realizes, well, oh no, I do love him. I want to be with him. It gets resolved. Maybe they live happily ever after. Maybe they don't. Maybe it ends bad. Who knows? Maybe he gets her at the end, and the last thing, and all of a sudden she tragically dies, and he loses everything. Could happen, right? We don't always have to have a happy ending. Lots of movies where the endings are not happy. Anybody see 12 Monkeys by Terry Gilliam?
Yeah, it's been a minute, but yeah.
So that movie, in my opinion, has one of the almost perfect scripts. It's so beautifully book-ended. So at the very last scene of the movie, all the loose ends just tie up. All the questions are answered. And they just did such a wonderful job. There's only one thing in the movie I don't like, and I won't even waste the time talking about it, but it's almost perfect except for one stupid thing. But the rest of it, it's just awesome. And there was a really well-written script. So that's a great example. Like everything gets tied up at the very end. The resolution happens. And in the end of that movie, it's not a happy, everybody lives happily ever after. What they were trying to prevent happening, they don't prevent it from happening. It does happen. So we don't have to have a happy ending all the time. Lots of movies do that, right? Because lots of times audiences want that happy ending. In fact, I'll even tell you another story, Terry Gilliam. So he's one of my favorite directors. He's definitely written some really quirky, cool movies. He's done some contemporary movies. You know, he had some breakout movies. He did Time Bandits. I don't know if anybody remember that. It was an older movie. It was his first big breakout. He was from Monty Python clan. He was one of the only American in Monty Python. And he did Time Bandits. He did Brazil. So Brazil was one of his big movies. It's a great movie. It's an awesome, film noir type movie. But I'll tell you real quick about it, how it ties into this, is that it was his low budget independent film. And he got greenlit from Universal, and they gave him the money to make it. And it was just not much money. We're talking like back in the 80s, $15 million, which is nothing to make a movie. And it was just going to be one of those art films that goes under the radar, and maybe they get a couple awards in a film festival and Universal. So Universal paid for it because that, they want to have some artsy movies that they can put, little, awards up and say, well, we we did this, we funded this, and got a cool artsy award, film festival award. Not intending Oscars or anything like that. And so he's making this film, and he wrote this really good, pretty good. He got this pretty good script. His screenwriter wrote it. And at one point, normally this thing would just go under the radar. All the executives, they just greenlight it. Such a low amount of money, nobody's going to care. But the executive at Universal decided to take an interest in the movie because he liked it, and he liked the director. And what happened was, as they were making the script, as they shot it, and as they edited it together, the executive decided, well, I don't really like the ending, because the ending was dark. It was really, and that was the whole point of the movie. The whole point of the movie was the ending, how it ended. And he was like, I think we need to have a happy ending. I think that's what this movie needs. And he's like, you know what, this might be a little more of a commercial movie if we make it a happy ending for everyone. Little guy beats and wins and does all this stuff. And Terry Gilliam was totally against it. And they ended up having this massive, massive battle where they literally were taking full page ads out in the Hollywood Reporter, fighting with each other. Basically, they were going to prevent him from releasing the movie. And they basically told Terry Gilliam that because of his contract, that he had to give them all the footage, and they were going to edit their own version. And so it turned into this massive war. And eventually Terry Gilliam won, and he got his movie out the way it is. But there's this brilliant book called The Battle of Brazil that talks about this whole Hollywood battle that went on and what it's like to work in the Hollywood system. And it pretty much put a bad taste in Gilliam's mouth, to the point where, he did make a couple movies after that were in Hollywood, but mostly he became an independent filmmaker. But the point here is that the story, the ending, he chose to make it not happy, but the studio tried to force him to make it happy, because they realized, well, all our movies should have happy endings, and they didn't need to. And in the end, he won. But if you ever get a chance to read it, Battle of Brazil, awesome read. Okay, so what do we want to ask in this? Well, how does the protagonist solve the main problem? What are the actions that solve it? How does the story end? Is it closed? Is this a bookend story where it just ends and there's no extension? There's no way to get past this ending? Or do we leave it open so that there's a sequel or another sequel and so forth, right? What happens to the protagonist? Is he defeated? Is she killed? Is she change her heart? What happens? I'm sorry, no, that's the antagonist. I'm talking about the protagonist. What happens? Did they get their goal? Did they succeed? Did they die? Whatever happened? What happened to the antagonist? Same thing. Did they change a heart? Did they die? Did they defeat the protagonist? What about all the other characters? How do you tie them up? So the end here is about resolving it, right? Usually, again, if we're following the regular path, then your protagonist is going to win, right? Finally get victory, get the girl, be happily ever after, win the money, whatever it is, finish the crime. So that's them. But what about all the other characters, all the other actors in there? Did those characters, did they resolve somehow? Did we find out what happened to them? If not, again, it leaves an awkward, frustrating feeling to your audience. If there's a certain sub character in there and we see them throughout it, and then in the end of the last act, we know nothing of what happened to them, that may not be cool, right? You might be walking away going, oh, wow, that's kind of lame. And think about the recent Star Wars movies, right? The Force Awakens and all of them. What was that? Was it Poe? What was it? What was the one guy, the Imperial trooper who turned good? So Finn's to me a great example of this, because we got the first movie where Finn, he escapes, he decides he's going to, escape the being in the Imperial army, join the rebels, and do all this stuff. And these characters like developing and developing and developing. And then at the last movie, they kind of just let him kind of forget about him, right? Remember, it just became about the two main characters, right? Ray and what's his face, Han Solo's kid. And so Finn suddenly became this secondary character that didn't quite do too much. And a lot of people, you know, complained about that. And there was a lot of fight back about that. Going, why did you write him off like that? Why didn't he was destined to be something bigger, right? And not to mention he was a person of color. He was in a big role, and they just kind of wrote him off, and it just became business as usual. So you don't want that to happen. If you have certain characters and they're developing, you want to finish them off. Everything basically, to have a really solid third act, you have to resolve all the problems, whether it's positive or negative for your main character, and you have to tie up all loose ends. Again, unless it's going to be written directly for a sequel, and you know for sure you're going to be making a sequel, then you got to be really careful about how you end stuff. So, like the new Dune, we talked about Dune a week or two ago. I know for a fact that they didn't tell the whole story. They couldn't tell the story in one movie. So guess what? They got to make two movies. And so they're hoping that it does well, which it probably will, so that they get the money to make the second one. But I know they're already in pre-production or development, so it seems like it's already happening. So that's one. Back to the Future. Anybody see that trilogy of Back to the Future?
Yeah.
That series was written for 3 movies. So the way they wrote it was that the first movie had an escape out of it, when basically Doc grabs them at the end and says, "You got to come to the future," and then they just take off at the end of the movie. If the movie flopped, they could probably end it there and everything will be all right. But they didn't do that. They actually went through and shot everything. Actually, that's a pretty amazing movie to study how they made it, because they actually got the budget, they got the green light to shoot all 3 movies at once, and they shot all 3 movies at the same time. So by the time it was done shooting, there was no chance of not getting the other movies distributed, because they already paid for them to be shot. And so that's why those movies were so tightly integrated. It was one of the few sets of movies with sequel and 2 sequels that really worked well, that's because they shot everything at the same time. So all the reshooting in the second movie, when they go back into the 1950s and you see the same angles, same scenes from a different angle, that wasn't them going back and reconstructing everything. No, they had those scripts written, and they were budgeted for it. They did it, and that made that work. So 3-act resolution, really important. So the thing about here, so these are the questions to ask. And then think about this. So Act 3 is where everything comes to a head. Characters confront their feelings, their desires, their goals. Features the resolution of the story and its subplots. Climax is the scene or sequence in which the main tension of the story are brought to their most intense point, and dramatic questions are finally answered, leaving the protagonist and other characters with a new sense of who they really are. So this is where the change happens. We need to walk away from, at the end here, that our characters have grown or learned or become someone new. And again, it's all about tying up loose ends and sending your characters off to the sunset, or killing everyone off and letting the bad guy escape. Could be that too. Remember Rogue One? We talked about Rogue One the other day. Remember the end of that movie? Spoiler alert. Everybody died. All the characters died at the end. They killed them all off because they had to. They had no choice, because none of those characters existed in the rest of the Star Wars universe. So everybody died in that movie. Still made it a good movie.